The strongest prison is the one that convinces you you're free. Think about the last promise you made to yourself. Maybe it was to stop scrolling late at night. Maybe it was to quit junk food, wake up before sunrise, exercise every morning, or finally finish that project you've been delaying for months. At the time, the promise felt real. You imagined a different version of yourself. Stronger. More disciplined. More in control. For a few days, maybe even a few weeks, everything changed. You woke up with determination. You resisted temptation. You believed this time would be different. Then something happened. A stressful day at work. A difficult conversation. A weekend that broke your routine. One small exception became two. Two became five. Before you realized it, the old habit had quietly reclaimed its place, as if nothing had ever changed. You told yourself you lacked discipline. You blamed your willpower. You searched for more motivation, more productivity hacks, more morning routines, hoping the next strategy would finally fix what felt broken inside you. But what if every failure you've experienced has been pointing toward a truth no one ever told you? What if your habits were never stronger than you? What if the real problem was that you were fighting the wrong battle from the very beginning? Most people believe bad habits are enemies waiting to be defeated through force. They declare war on themselves every Monday morning, convinced that enough determination will erase years of automatic behavior. They sprint forward with enormous effort, only to collapse under the weight of expectations they created themselves. Then they start over. Again. And again. Every restart quietly convinces them they are the kind of person who always quits. The habit doesn't destroy their confidence. The cycle does. Somewhere, without noticing, they stop trusting their own promises. They become careful about dreaming too big because disappointment feels familiar. They lower their expectations, not because they want less from life, but because hope has become exhausting. This invisible prison is built one broken promise at a time, and unlike iron bars, it cannot be seen. It exists inside ordinary mornings, ordinary decisions, ordinary excuses that sound completely reasonable. I'll start after the holidays. Next month will be easier. I'm too tired today. Tomorrow will be better. Those words don't sound dangerous. They sound responsible. They sound human. Yet they quietly shape an identity that becomes harder to escape with every passing year. The most dangerous habits are rarely the ones everyone notices. They are the silent patterns that teach you to doubt yourself. They convince you that change belongs to other people, people born with more discipline, more confidence, more luck. But centuries before modern psychology tried to explain human behavior, a quiet philosophy emerged in Japan that viewed this struggle very differently. It did not ask how to defeat bad habits. It asked a far more unsettling question. What if the person trying to change is creating the very resistance that keeps the habit alive? That single question would eventually transform the life of one ordinary American man who believed he had already failed too many times to ever become someone new. Ethan Carter was 36 years old, successful enough for strangers to assume he had his life together, yet privately exhausted by a pattern that had followed him for almost half his life. His phone contained fitness applications he had abandoned, language courses he never finished, budgeting spreadsheets he stopped updating, and dozens of reminders that no longer meant anything because he had learned to ignore every notification that came from his own promises. One evening, after putting his 8-year-old son to bed, Ethan opened a notebook he had forgotten in the back of a kitchen drawer. Every January he bought a new one, convinced that this would be the year everything changed. The first pages were filled with perfect handwriting, ambitious goals, detailed schedules, and inspiring quotes. Then the writing slowly became shorter, messier, and finally disappeared altogether. Curious, he gathered the notebooks from previous years. One after another, they told exactly the same story. Different dates. Different goals. The same ending. He spent nearly an hour counting. Every serious attempt he had made to change some part of his life. Wake up at 5 in the morning. Stop eating late at night. Read 20 pages every evening. Exercise 6 days a week. Delete social media. Save more money. Learn Japanese. Drink more water. Meditate daily. The final number stunned him. 147 fresh starts. 147 moments when he genuinely believed a new version of himself was about to emerge. 147 quiet endings that no one else ever noticed. He leaned back in his chair and laughed, not because it was funny, but because he no longer knew what else to do. The strangest part was that he had never lacked effort. Every beginning felt sincere. Every promise came from a real desire to become better. Yet somehow, the person making those promises always disappeared a few weeks later, replaced by someone who negotiated with every decision. Just this once. Tomorrow instead. I deserve a break. Life is stressful right now. Those sentences had become so familiar that they no longer sounded like excuses. They sounded like his own voice. For the first time, Ethan stopped asking why he could not stay disciplined. Instead, another question quietly entered his mind. Why did every version of himself eventually become the same person again? That question followed him everywhere. During his commute. During meetings. While standing in line for coffee. It stayed with him until one rainy Saturday afternoon when he wandered into a small independent bookstore simply to escape the weather. As he browsed without purpose, an elderly man arranging books nearby noticed the stack of self-improvement titles in Ethan's hands and smiled with surprising kindness. He asked only one question. Are you collecting new answers, or are you repeating the same question? Ethan froze. He had never met the man before, yet somehow the words landed with uncomfortable precision. Before Ethan could respond, the stranger gently returned one of the books to the shelf and said, "Most people try to build a new life by making bigger promises. Very few ever ask whether the promises themselves are the problem." Those words lingered in Ethan's mind. Long after he left the store, because for the first time in years, someone had not offered him another strategy. They had quietly challenged the foundation beneath every attempt he had ever made. For the next several days, Ethan could not forget the stranger's question. It did not motivate him. It unsettled him. Every time he reached for his phone without thinking, every time he postponed a task by promising himself he would do it later, those words quietly returned. Are you collecting new answers, or are you repeating the same question? At first, he dismissed them as clever philosophy. But the more he reflected, the more he realized something uncomfortable. Every attempt he had ever made began with the assumption that his future self would somehow possess more discipline than the person making the decision today. He always expected tomorrow's version of himself to be stronger, more focused, more patient, and somehow immune to the same temptations that defeated him yesterday. Yet tomorrow always arrived carrying the same mind, the same emotions, and the same habits. 1 week later, Ethan returned to the bookstore, hoping to find the elderly man again. He searched every aisle before finally spotting him quietly arranging books near a small shelf dedicated to Japanese philosophy. The man smiled as though he had expected Ethan to come back. "You returned sooner than most people," he said softly. Ethan admitted that he could not stop thinking about their conversation. He expected another recommendation, another book, another productivity system. Instead, the man asked him to sit beside a window overlooking the rain outside. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The silence felt unusual at first, then strangely comfortable. Finally, the man looked toward the falling rain and asked a single question. "When you plant a tree, do you pull on the branches every morning to make it grow faster?" Ethan almost laughed. "Of course not." "Why?" the man continued. "Because that would damage it," Ethan replied. The man nodded. Yet that is exactly how most people try to change themselves. They demand immediate transformation. They expect dramatic results after only a few days. They measure every small effort against an impossible future, and when they do not become a different person overnight, they conclude that the process has failed. Ethan remained silent. The comparison was painfully accurate. Every plan he had ever created demanded a complete reinvention of his life. Wake up earlier. Eat perfectly. Exercise every day. Read every night. Eliminate every distraction. He tried to become someone entirely different before proving he could become someone slightly better. The elderly man gently reached for a blank piece of paper and placed a single dot in the center. "What do you see?" he asked. "A dot," Ethan answered. "Most people do," the man replied. "But the dot is not the important part. What matters is the empty space around it." Growth works the same way. People obsess over dramatic moments while ignoring the quiet space where change is actually built. Ethan looked at the paper without fully understanding, but something inside him had already begun to shift. For the first time, he realized he had spent years chasing breakthroughs while overlooking ordinary days. He had been searching for the perfect moment to become disciplined instead of respecting the countless ordinary moments where discipline quietly takes shape. Before Ethan left, the man handed him a small card with only 3 handwritten words. "Do less today." There was nothing else. No explanation. No instructions. No promise. As Ethan folded the card into his wallet, he could not understand why 3 simple words felt heavier than every motivational speech he had ever heard. He had come looking for another solution. Instead, he left carrying a question that would quietly dismantle everything he believed about change. The next morning, Ethan stood in his kitchen holding the small card between his fingers. "Do less today." It sounded almost ridiculous. Every self-improvement message he had ever consumed encouraged bigger goals, greater effort, complete transformation. This message asked for the opposite. Part of him wanted to ignore it. Another part, the part that had restarted 147 times, quietly whispered that perhaps doing the opposite was exactly what he had never tried. Instead of creating another detailed schedule, Ethan made only one decision. After breakfast, he would put on his running shoes. That was all. Not run 3 miles. Not complete a workout. Not burn a certain number of calories. Simply put on the shoes. His mind protested immediately. That cannot possibly matter. It is too small. It is meaningless. But he remembered the elderly man's comparison about the tree. Growth was not built by pulling harder. It was built by respecting the process. So after washing his coffee mug, Ethan walked to the front door, slipped on his running shoes, tied the laces carefully, and stood there. The habit was complete. He smiled awkwardly, almost embarrassed by how insignificant it felt. Then he took the shoes off and continued with his day. Nothing dramatic happened. There was no rush of confidence. No inspiring music seemed to play in the background of his life. The world remained exactly the same. Yet something invisible had changed. That evening, for the first time in years, he had kept a promise to himself without negotiating, delaying, or silently changing the rules halfway through. The next morning, he repeated the same action. Shoes on. Laces tied. This time he stepped outside and stood on the porch for 1 minute before walking back inside. Again, his mind argued that this was pointless. It insisted real change required bigger sacrifices. But another voice, quieter than before, simply reminded him to keep the promise exactly as it had been made. By the 4th day, standing outside naturally became a short walk to the end of the driveway. A few days later, the driveway became a walk around the block. Nothing had been forced. Nothing had been demanded. The habit expanded because it wanted to, not because Ethan tried to overpower himself. Then he noticed something even stranger. The resistance that had always appeared before every new routine was beginning to fade. Not disappear completely, but soften. The endless internal debates grew shorter. The excuses became less convincing. He realized that his greatest enemy had never been laziness. It had been the enormous distance between who he was and who he expected himself to become overnight. Every ambitious plan had frightened the very mind he hoped would cooperate. Every impossible expectation invited resistance before action even began. Small actions, however, slipped quietly beneath that resistance. They asked for almost nothing, and because they asked for so little, they were completed without conflict. One evening Ethan returned to the bookstore and shared what had happened. The elderly man listened without interruption before gently saying, "People believe confidence creates action. More often, action creates confidence. But only when the action is small enough to survive an ordinary day." Ethan looked down at his hands and understood that the running shoes had never been the lesson. They had simply been the doorway. If something so small could begin changing the way he saw himself, then perhaps every lasting transformation started long before anyone could see it. And for the first time, he became curious not about how far he could go, but about how many invisible victories had been quietly waiting for him all along. The following week, Ethan noticed that the smallest victories were quietly changing more than his morning routine. He no longer argued with himself before putting on his running shoes. He no longer waited for inspiration before stepping outside. The action had become ordinary, almost invisible, and that was precisely why it survived. One afternoon, he asked the elderly man a question that had been growing in his mind. "If this is so effective, why does everyone tell us to think bigger?" The old man smiled as if he had heard the same question countless times before. "Because dramatic stories attract attention," he replied. "Quiet transformation rarely does." He picked up a small notebook from the shelf and slowly opened its blank pages. Imagine you are asked to fill this notebook with a single line every day. Most people will write 10 pages on the first day because they feel inspired. By the 5th day they feel tired. By the 10th day they quit. Another person writes only one sentence every day. It feels insignificant. Almost disappointing. But 1 year later, whose notebook is full? Ethan immediately understood. He had always confused intensity with consistency. He believed that changing his life required extraordinary effort, when in reality it required ordinary actions repeated long enough to become part of who he was. The elderly man continued. "There is an old Japanese philosophy called Kaizen. Many people misunderstand it. They think it is about making small improvements because they are afraid of making big ones. That is not the point. The point is that small improvements bypass the fear that stops big improvements before they ever begin." Ethan thought about every ambitious plan he had abandoned. Every one of them demanded that he become a different person on the very first day. His schedules were perfect. His expectations were impossible. He never gave himself permission to grow gradually because gradual progress did not feel exciting. Yet excitement had never carried him very far. "Your mind," the old man said softly, "is not naturally opposed to growth. It is opposed to uncertainty. When change appears too large, your mind protects the life it already understands. Not because it wants you to fail, but because familiarity feels safer than possibility." Those words dissolved years of frustration in a single moment. Ethan stopped seeing himself as weak. He stopped believing he lacked discipline. His mind had never been his enemy. It had simply been defending what it believed was normal. The battle was never about forcing himself forward. It was about making each new step feel safe enough to repeat tomorrow. That evening, Ethan looked around his home differently. Instead of asking what he could completely transform, he asked what tiny action would quietly become easier if he repeated it every day. 1 glass of water before coffee. 1 page before sleep. 1 minute of stretching after work. 1 conversation without looking at his phone. The changes looked almost too small to matter, yet they shared something every previous plan had lacked. They were sustainable. Weeks passed, and something unexpected happened. Ethan no longer measured success by dramatic results. He measured it by promises kept. Every small action became another vote for the person he was becoming. His identity was changing so gradually that he almost failed to notice it. But deep beneath those ordinary moments, an invisible foundation was taking shape, and he had the unmistakable feeling that the philosophy he had only begun to understand was still hiding principles far more powerful than anything he had discovered so far. As autumn slowly replaced the heat of summer, Ethan realized that his life no longer felt like a series of heroic efforts followed by quiet disappointments. The changes were subtle enough that almost no one noticed them. His co-workers simply thought he seemed calmer during stressful meetings. His wife noticed he no longer reached for his phone every few minutes during dinner. His son smiled when evening walks gradually became part of their routine instead of another promise that disappeared after a week. The remarkable part was that Ethan had not forced any of these changes. They had grown naturally from the same small decisions he had once considered meaningless. During one of his visits to the bookstore, the elderly man invited Ethan to share tea in a quiet corner surrounded by shelves filled with history and philosophy. After listening patiently, he nodded with quiet satisfaction. "Now you are ready to understand why this works," he said. "Not because you have mastered the method, but because you have experienced it." He explained that many people searched for techniques before they developed the patience to recognize their value. They wanted answers before they understood the questions. Ethan had finally reached the point where experience could give meaning to ideas that once sounded ordinary. The old man gently described several principles that had quietly guided Ethan without him realizing it. The first was Kaizen, the practice of continuous improvement through steps so small that resistance rarely appears. The second was Ganbaru, the quiet decision to continue with sincerity even when progress is invisible. The third was Wabi-sabi, the acceptance that growth is naturally imperfect and that flaws are not evidence of failure but signs of an authentic journey. The fourth was Shoshin, the beginner's mind, approaching each day without the burden of believing yesterday's mistakes must define today's choices. Finally came Ikigai, not as a distant life purpose waiting to be discovered, but as a reason to care for the ordinary moments that eventually shape an extraordinary life. Ethan noticed something fascinating. None of these ideas demanded perfection. None promised instant success. None encouraged endless pressure. Instead, every principle quietly redirected attention toward today's smallest action. Together they formed something stronger than motivation because they did not depend on emotion. They depended on repetition. The elderly man poured more tea before speaking again. People believe they fail because they lose motivation. More often they fail because they expect motivation to stay. Seasons change. Emotions change. Energy changes. But identity grows from what you repeat when none of those feelings are present. Ethan looked out the window as leaves drifted gently across the sidewalk. Nature never rushed from summer into winter overnight. Every lasting transformation unfolded through countless changes too small to notice in a single day. Yet no one doubted that autumn would eventually arrive. He suddenly understood why his previous attempts had always collapsed. He had demanded visible results before allowing invisible roots to develop. He wanted fruit before planting the seed. Now the process felt different. Every ordinary choice reinforced the person he was becoming instead of reminding him of the person he wished he were. As he prepared to leave, the elderly man quietly smiled and said, "The greatest changes in life rarely announce themselves. One day you simply realize you no longer think like the person you used to be." Ethan carried those words home, unaware that the most important proof of his transformation would arrive not during an extraordinary achievement, but during a day so ordinary that he almost failed to recognize it. Winter arrived quietly, without asking for permission. The mornings became colder, daylight faded earlier, and the excitement that had carried Ethan through the first weeks of change disappeared almost completely. Surprisingly, this did not worry him anymore. Months earlier, he would have mistaken the absence of excitement for failure. Now he understood that motivation had never been designed to last forever. One ordinary Tuesday, his alarm rang before sunrise. He opened his eyes, looked toward the dark window, and felt absolutely no desire to get out of bed. There was no inspiration. No powerful emotion. No dramatic vision of a better future. For a brief moment, the old voice returned. Skip today. One day will not matter. You deserve more rest. It was the same voice that had ended 147 fresh starts. Ethan listened without arguing. Then, almost without thinking, he sat up, placed his feet on the floor, and walked toward the front door. He tied his running shoes exactly as he had done dozens of times before. There was nothing heroic about the moment. It felt almost boring. He stepped outside, took a slow breath, and began walking through the quiet neighborhood. The streets were nearly empty. Frost covered the grass. The only sound came from his footsteps meeting the sidewalk. Halfway through the walk, Ethan suddenly realized something unusual. He was no longer convincing himself to continue. There was no internal debate. No negotiation. His body simply followed a pattern that had become familiar. Months ago, he believed discipline meant constantly defeating temptation. Now he discovered something completely different. The greatest form of discipline was reaching a point where the argument no longer needed to happen. The habit had quietly become part of his identity. Later that afternoon, he stopped by the bookstore and shared the experience with the elderly man. Instead of congratulating him, the man simply smiled. "Today was your most important victory," he said. Ethan looked confused. It was only a normal walk. The old man nodded. Exactly. Most people believe transformation happens on extraordinary days. It almost never does. It happens on ordinary days when nobody is watching, when nothing feels exciting, and when there is no reward waiting at the finish. Those are the days that decide who you become. Ethan reflected on those words. Throughout the week, he realized that every major turning point in his life had once seemed dramatic because he only remembered the outcome. He had never noticed the countless quiet mornings that made the outcome possible. Success had always hidden itself inside repetition. The elderly man later explained that people often celebrate visible achievements while ignoring invisible consistency. They applaud the finished marathon but overlook the hundreds of ordinary walks. They admire the skilled musician but forget the countless simple practice sessions. They praise confidence without recognizing the thousands of small promises someone quietly kept to themselves long before anyone noticed. Ethan finally understood why his old life had been trapped inside endless cycles. He had been chasing moments instead of building patterns. Moments inspired him. Patterns transformed him. As the weeks continued, there was no dramatic breakthrough waiting around the corner. There was only another ordinary morning, another ordinary decision, and another quiet promise kept without applause. Yet hidden inside those simple days, something far greater than a habit was taking shape. Ethan was no longer practicing a routine. He was becoming the kind of person who no longer needed to ask whether he would follow through. By the time spring returned, Ethan no longer measured his progress by counting days or checking boxes on a calendar. In fact, he had stopped thinking about progress altogether. The routines that once demanded constant attention now occupied so little mental energy that they felt as natural as brushing his teeth or locking the front door before leaving home. One evening, while preparing dinner with his son, he noticed something unexpected. His phone buzzed with a notification from one of the social media applications he used to open dozens of times every day. Without thinking, he glanced at the screen, smiled faintly, and placed the phone face down on the counter. There was no struggle. No temptation. No internal speech reminding himself to stay disciplined. The moment passed almost unnoticed. A few seconds later, he realized what had just happened. Months earlier, that same notification would have interrupted everything. It would have pulled his attention away almost automatically. Now it had become little more than background noise. The habit had not disappeared because he fought harder. It had quietly lost its place in the person he had become. That realization stayed with him as he walked to the bookstore later that week. Before Ethan could describe what had happened, the elderly man looked at him and smiled. "You are walking differently," he said. Ethan laughed, unsure what he meant. "Not your steps," the man replied. "Your mind." They sat near the same window where their conversations had begun months before. The old man gently explained that people often believe habits define identity, when in reality identity is shaped by the habits repeated often enough to become ordinary. Every small promise Ethan had kept was never just an isolated action. It was a quiet vote for the kind of person he believed himself to be. One vote seemed insignificant. Hundreds of quiet votes eventually became certainty. "You never defeated your old self," the elderly man continued. "You simply stopped feeding it." Ethan reflected on those words during the drive home. For years, he had imagined change as a battle between two versions of himself. One disciplined. One distracted. One strong. One weak. But there had never been two people. There had only been one person making thousands of tiny decisions, each one gently shaping the direction of his life. The future had never arrived through a dramatic leap. It had been assembled one ordinary moment at a time. That evening, his son asked if they could take their usual walk together. Months earlier, Ethan might have promised they would go tomorrow because work had been exhausting. This time he simply smiled, put on his shoes, and opened the front door. The answer required no effort because it matched who he had become. As they walked beneath the fading sunlight, Ethan realized that discipline no longer felt like a burden he carried. It felt like a quiet companion that walked beside him without demanding attention. The elderly man's lessons had never been about creating perfect routines. They had been about creating a life where good decisions became easier because they were no longer strangers. For the first time, Ethan understood that lasting transformation was never about becoming extraordinary overnight. It was about becoming so deeply aligned with small daily actions that the person he once hoped to become eventually felt completely familiar. And although he believed he finally understood the journey, life was about to reveal the simplest proof of all, one that could never be measured by a calendar, a habit tracker, or a number on a page. 5 years passed, and if someone had asked Ethan when his life finally changed, he would not have been able to give them a date. There was no dramatic breakthrough. No unforgettable morning. No single decision that divided his life into before and after. The transformation had happened so quietly that he only recognized it when he could no longer remember the person who once believed change required constant struggle. His notebooks were different now. They no longer contained endless lists of ambitious resolutions waiting to be abandoned. Instead, they held simple reflections, small observations, and quiet gratitude for ordinary days that once would have felt insignificant. His morning walks had gradually become regular runs, not because he forced himself to improve, but because his body naturally followed the rhythm of a life built through consistency. Reading had become part of every evening. Time with his family no longer competed with endless distractions. Work still brought pressure, unexpected problems still appeared, and difficult seasons still arrived, but those moments no longer pushed him back into old patterns because his identity was no longer built on temporary motivation. One Saturday afternoon, while organizing old boxes in the garage, Ethan discovered the notebooks from years before. He slowly turned each page, recognizing the familiar cycle of excitement followed by silence. For a moment, he felt compassion for the younger version of himself. He had never been weak. He had simply believed that becoming someone new required becoming someone else overnight. His son, now a teenager, picked up one of the notebooks and smiled with curiosity. "Did you really start over this many times?" Ethan laughed softly and nodded. "I thought that was the only way to change." His son looked surprised. "What changed?" Ethan paused before answering because the truth was much simpler than he once imagined. "I stopped trying to build a different future," he said. "I started protecting one small promise every day." Later that week, Ethan returned to the bookstore for what had become an annual visit. The elderly man was arranging books exactly as he had been years before, moving with the same calm presence that had first challenged everything Ethan believed about change. They shared tea beside the familiar window, watching people hurry through the streets outside. Ethan thanked him for everything he had learned. The old man smiled gently and shook his head. "I gave you very little," he replied. "You simply learned to notice what was already waiting inside ordinary days." They sat together in comfortable silence. Finally, the elderly man spoke one last time. "People spend their lives searching for a moment that will change everything. They rarely notice that life changes one ordinary decision at a time. A mountain is never moved in a single day. It disappears one handful of earth at a time." As Ethan walked home beneath the evening sky, he realized the greatest lesson had never been about breaking a bad habit. It had been about becoming someone who quietly honored the smallest commitments even when nobody was watching. The habits changed because the person changed. The person changed because the daily choices changed. And the daily choices changed because he finally stopped asking how to become extraordinary and began asking a far quieter question every morning. What is the smallest promise I can keep today that my future self will thank me for tomorrow?